Hello, I am Yesiltepe. I am an urban planner and designer and currently a research associate at Lancaster University in architecture and in imagination. Um, Today I will going to present a review that we conducted with Professor Ruth Conroy Dalton, and we aim to explore the relationship between children's physical activity levels and obesity status in urban and rural areas. In this presentation, first we will start with a brief introduction, so we will focus on research gap and aim, and then we will talk about a comparison between urban and rural areas, first considering the physical activity levels, environment, and BMI status in general, and then by focusing on commuting to school activities behavior in urban and rural areas, and at this point we will again discuss impact of different factors. And then we will just explain the findings of the researcher, and we will focus on the future studies. Over 340 million children and adolescents aged between 5 and 19 were overweight or obese in 2016. Obesity is preventable by limiting the energy intake, increasing consumption of healthy food, or increasing physical activity, according to World Health Organization. Thus, a vast number of studies aim to understand the relationship between physical activity and obesity in detail, but they also considered additional factors, such as socioeconomic status or environmental factors. Literature explored the relationship between children's obesity and physical activity levels, socioeconomic status, and environmental factors using various components. However, the number of studies focused on these issues in urban and rural environments is quite limited. And this is why we aim to focus on children's obesity status, physical activity levels, and environment in urban and rural areas. And while doing this, we first investigate the association between children's obesity and physical activity levels in urban and rural areas in general. But then we will take this a step further, and we will focus on children's travel mode to school and its relationship with these two factors. While focusing on these physical activity levels and BMI status relationship, we aim to understand actually several different factors. We will try to understand the location where the studies took place, the population and age group used in these studies, definition of urban and rural areas, examination of physical activity levels, examination of obesity status, criteria analyzed to understand the environment, such as safety, land use, etc., sedentary behavior, and socioeconomic factors. So all these factors are analyzed in the papers we focused on. In addition, we also aim to understand how these factors are related and how the findings of the studies can be interpreted. So you can see the list of papers we analyzed for the first part of this study, and considering these articles, we analyzed the points I mentioned in the previous slide. The papers were found after a Google Scholar search using the terms urban, rural, obesity, and physical activity. And as I said before, first we focused on the location where the studies took place and the population and age group. First of all, studies compared urban and rural areas conducted in different countries or cities, including but not limited to Australia, Scotland, USA, Spain, Cyprus, Taiwan, Canada, or Turkey. So in many countries, we see this comparison between urban and rural areas and children's physical activity levels. Considering population and age group, on the other hand, we can say that this actually varied from approximately 170 children to 3,500 children in the examined studies, and the children's age varied from 2 to 19. However, we can say that most of the studies focus on children aged between 8 and 12. Considering another heading, we had definition of urban and rural areas. We can say that actually most of the studies defined urban or rural areas using population data. So for instance, Dolman used 20,000 as a threshold, or Crory used 3,000 population in Scotland for a threshold, or Shillon used 10,000 and above as a threshold in their studies in Spain. So the population over these numbers were accepted as urban areas, and population below these numbers were accepted as rural areas. However, we can also say that, for instance, Macquarie, yes, they use this population data, but they also use additional data. For instance, they also focused on population density or accessibility in order to understand urban areas. And we also see other factors, not only the population, but also other factors. So urban and rural definition was also done using the size of the settlements and the degree of urbanization and proximity to metro areas, for instance, or using data provided by the Ministry of Education, considering the definitions developed by other institutions, such as universities. So at this point, it is important to note that each country can have different approaches to define urban and rural areas. However, it is really important for these studies to clarify this distinction in their studies to help the reader understand, to better understand or interpret the results. So it is really important to clarify how we define urban and rural areas for the readers and for other researchers. In the studies we discussed, examination of physical activity levels was basically done in two ways. They are either measured by the researchers, or they are reported by the children or the parents. So for the first part, if the physical activity was measured by the researchers, different factors such as shuttle run, sit and reach, and all these different factors could be used to better understand their physical activity levels. An accelerometer was also used in these studies really commonly. Questionnaires were also used to examine physical activity. So students, for instance, were asked about their sport participation, or the type of sports activity they did, or they were asked if they did exercise at school or outside at school, or they were asked the frequency of their participation in hard and moderate physical activity in general. Hence, different approaches could be used in these surveys, we can say. Even though it is nice to see actually that different approaches can be used to understand children's physical activity levels, we should also say that research stated that it might be better to measure it by ourselves, by the researchers, rather than using self-reports, as self-reports can be actually misleading. Other two criteria we mentioned before were examination of obesity status, or the criteria analyzed to understand the environment. So for the first one, for the obesity, we can say that it is measured using body mass index most commonly, but also using body fat or other anthropometric measurements such as skin fold thickness or waist circumference. On the other hand, studies mostly focused on urban or rural distinction mostly. However, several studies analyzed the environment in detail, and they analyzed, for instance, dwelling density, street path intersection density, safety, activity areas such as parks or playgrounds, aesthetics or convenience, so location of stores, for instance. For the last heading, socioeconomic factors, we can say that different measures were also used for this one. Household income or socioeconomic deprivation, school card register, percentage of students eligible for free or reduced cost lunches, parents or caretakers' education levels were analyzed in these studies. Hence, we can see that the income was an important and repeated measure in these studies. Moreover, age, gender, race were also asked in many studies, as this could be effective on the results. Parents' height and weight was also asked in studies, as this could be effective on children's results as genetic factors. And studies also focused on children's eating habits, considering their nutritional behavior, for instance. So we could see all these different factors and their impact on children's behavior, children's physical activity levels in the analyzed literature. Hence, we can briefly say that we can focus on 5 different components specifically, other than genetic attitudes or any other personal circumstances in general. And we can focus on physical activity, sedentary behavior, socioeconomic status, environmental factors, or eating habits in order to better understand obesity, an important health issue. Results of the studies on physical activity levels, various environmental factors, and obesity varies in urban and rural areas. For example, some of the studies did observe no significant difference between urban and rural areas. Some discovered that rural kids were healthier and more active, or some discovered that urban children actually were more active and healthier. So actually there is no consensus in the literature. In one of the studies, on the other hand, it is mentioned that children's race, climate, safety, socioeconomic status, or many other factors vary from one country to another, so it is actually inappropriate to generalize results in urban and rural areas or generalize them amongst different countries. Since the current literature presents various findings, actually this idea can be supported. Each continent, country, city, or even neighborhood may provide different results. Current literature shows that there are various measures to consider in order to have more accurate results, such as traffic exposure, public park or private garden access, population density, number of or density of housing areas, or the number of intersections, sedentary behavior, or even gender or season. So future studies can consider all these factors together in order to better understand their impact or their relationship with obesity. So in the first part of the review, we made a comparison considering the environment in general. But now we will focus on literature that made analysis around home and school environments and this journey. So similar to the studies discussed above, studies on commuting to school in urban and rural areas also discussed different factors, and the results of the studies also here highlighted various results. For example, one of the studies aimed to understand if geographical data, access to walking trails, or school journeys could help predict physical activity and sedentary activities in Norway. No difference could be observed between urban and rural children considering physical activity patterns in this study. They could only observe that urban children walk 3 times greater than rural children. Or in another study, it is purpose to determine the prevalence of active commuting to school in urban and rural areas in Colombia. And the results of the study showed no differences in active commuting between urban and suburban schools. Authors mentioned that factors such as crime, traffic congestion, or other aspects of the environment were not considered in this study, and this should be actually explored in the future studies. Moreover, other researchers aim to compare microenvironmental barriers and perceived barriers in 2 suburban communities and 1 new urban community. The new urban community was found more walkable than suburban areas in this study. New urban blocks, walking routes, for example, were considered more walkable in urban areas, and they were thought as more pedestrian friendly. Another study aimed to examine urban and rural differences in children's independent mobility and focused on primary and secondary school children. Results of this study show that boys attending urban primary schools had highest rates of cycling and walking independently to school. The researchers stated that more research is needed to examine social factors such as safety concerns. In the last study, Rodriguez et al., on the other hand, purposed to explore travel characteristics in children and examine factors associated with active commuting in children living in urban and rural areas. Results of this study, contrary to others, show that walking to school was more common among children living in rural areas this time. Weakness of this study also reported by the researchers, which mostly pointed to socioeconomic factors again. Finally, another important study was conducted by Molina Garcia et al. The researchers focused on walkability index using micro and macro scale environmental factors in urban and rural areas in Spain. And they discovered that intersection density, number of intersections, and residential density were related to active commuting to school in urban environments, but negatively related to active commuting to school in rural environments. They also observed that in rural children, positive streetscape characteristics, number of regulated crossings, traffic lanes, or parking street buffers were negatively related to active commuting to school, and positive streetscape characteristics, number of regulated crossings, or crossing quality were positively related to urban children. Hence, actually, the authors stated that while creating walkability indexes, different factors should be used in urban and rural areas. This finding is significant because currently there are many studies on walkability. However, this study underpins an important point that this index and the factors can be used to describe it can vary in different environments. To conclude, I can say that if studies aim to explore obesity and physical activity relationship, they actually can measure and consider all these different factors, and they can use these measures listed here. So they can, for instance, explore obesity using BMI or body fat information. They can explore sedentary behavior by analyzing time spent watching TV or playing games. Or they can use physical activity levels. They can measure it themselves rather than using self-reports. They can focus on perceptions, both children's perceptions or parental perceptions, to better understand how they are actually limit people behavior, children's behavior. Or they can focus on different environmental measures, focusing on both micro and macro level attributes. Or they can also focus eating habits to better understand the impact of all these factors in urban and rural areas. As a next step, on the other hand, what I and Ruth we really want to aim is that we want to first of all convert this study into a systematic review, and we would like to also conduct a research study including as many factors as possible to answer many gaps in the literature that we defined also in this presentation. And we also would like to work with children from different age groups because, as I mentioned in different parts of the presentation, results can vary from primary school children to secondary school children, for instance. So we also would like to include all these different age groups as well. So actually we also would like to explore many gaps we defined here as future studies. So thank you all for listening, and this is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, you can ask, and you can also contact me using this email address in this presentation, in this slide. Thank you.